Welcome to Femme Furious, a podcast where pop culture meets a feminine framing. I am your host, Julia Rose Portela, and today we are hanging out in a junkyard, as one does during Stranger Things, trying to catch one Demogorgon. But before we dive into today's episode, let me tell you how you can follow and support the pod. You can subscribe on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also watch full video breakdowns on YouTube and on Spotify. Follow on TikTok and on Instagram at Femme and Furious Pod. And you can send an email if you've got thoughts and feelings about our Stranger Things deep dive or up and coming this week, Taylor Swift's new album. That is over at femmeandfuriouspod@gmail.com. And last but not least, you can join the free newsletter, Lipstick and Lore. It will give you access to whatever's going on in the world, pop culturally, as well as a little bit of a chic peek behind the scenes of what is happening on the podcast. Speaking of chic peeks, let's take one at today's episode. This is a blanket spoiler warning because while this episode will focus on Season 2, Episodes 4 through 6, it is very possible and likely that anything may emerge from future seasons of Stranger Things in the Stranger Things universe. Okay. Let's dive into this week's Femme Frame, where we will look at key feminist themes, history, cultural context, and more. I want you to do something for me right now. I want you to close your eyes. Unless you're driving, don't close your eyes. I want you to take a deep breath and imagine a treatment room. A cold table, a clinician with clipped hands, a machine that hums like a bad refrigerator, and you, the patient, strapped down. Maybe you're crying. Maybe you're confused. Maybe you have been told there's no other option. And then there's a flash, a convulsion, a blackout, and later gaps in your memory, a fog of identity, or worse, silence stitched into the rest of your life. That room in the public imagination belongs to many horror movies in the 20th century, including Stranger Things. But in the real world, that room belongs to a history where medicine, gender, and power have consistently intersected in some of the ugliest ways. Today we are talking about electric shock therapy, where it came from, how it has disproportionately touched and controlled women, what feminist historians and survivors have said about it, and why this conversation still matters today. So here's the short history. Here's how we got here. Here's why it matters. Electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, as medicine tries to sanitize it, was developed in the late 1930s by Italians, particularly Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini. It was born out of a search for somatic or body-based therapy that would be used to treat severe mental illness. At the time, psychiatry was desperate for anything that might, quote-unquote, fix people who were being institutionalized in appalling numbers and under dreadful conditions nonetheless. ECT promised a quick dramatic effect to induce a seizure in which patients would sometimes, perhaps, improve. It spread fast into hospitals in the US, the UK, and beyond, and it became one of the few surviving somatic therapies from that era according to PMC. Here's the feminist angle beyond just the headlines. The historical development of ECT wasn't just about clinical utility. It happened inside a social system that had a long, gendered track record of policing women's bodies and minds. Nothing new. We're used to that. For centuries, hysteria, which we've already discussed on this podcast in relation to Stranger Things, was a catch-all pseudo-medical diagnosis, and it functioned as a social tool to label women who deviated from the ideal, which was docile domesticity. Treatments for so-called hysteria ranged from placatory, which tended to be massage therapy or hypnotic suggestions, to an even more horrific exploration, which was isolation, forced institutionalization, and physical, quote-unquote, therapies. And those therapies included electrotherapy forms long before the modern invention of ECT. The long shadow of hysteria meant that women were already overrepresented in asylums and already read as emotional, unstable, my personal favorite, overly sexual, and thus already prime targets for radical interventions according to PubMed. It is crucial to be historically precise. So ECT as a formal technique dates back to the 1930s, but the idea of using electricity and other physical modalities to quote-unquote correct women's minds goes much, much further back, which means that we should view ECT not as an isolated invention, but as a new instrument for that time in an old toolkit of gendered control. If you do a quick, ugly scan of ECT's demographic footprint in many countries, you will find that there is a similar pattern, which is that a majority of recipients have historically been women. That's partly because conditions for which ECT was used tended to be around major depressive disorder, certain psychoses, catatonia, all of which have high female prevalence in institutional settings. But it's also because women were more likely to be institutionalized for behaviors that transgressed against social norms. Being difficult, sexually independent, politically outspoken, or simply inconvenient to a husband could all be enough to get a woman referred to psychiatry and therefore institutionalization. Once in the system, your options shrank as a woman. The patient becomes a subject rather than an agent of their own autonomy. The combined effect is quite predictable and something that we still see today, a gendered funnel straight into procedures that promised compliance or calm. But let's not reduce the story to just numbers. There are lived narratives, women who have reported profound memory loss, personality change, and an afterlife of electric shock therapy in which key chunks of their memory are missing. There are also activist histories, organized survivor moments in the late 20th and early 21st centuries that challenged the claims of safety and consent and demanded regulation. Linda Andre and others, for example, became prominent voices documenting survivor experiences and urging for stricter oversight. Here's where the feminist critique gets even sharper. Medicine is theoretically a consent-based practice, but psychiatry, particularly institutional psychiatry, has historically operated with far less deference to consent. And that's a power problem that maps onto gender. People in psychiatric hospitals are often there not by choice, but through commitment, guardianship, or forced admission. That's why I think in modern years, recently, Britney Spears was so triggering for a lot of women, and that's why international bodies have become increasingly more explicit. The World Health Organization and the UN guidance in recent years have insisted on human rights-centered approaches to mental health and have called attention to coercive practices, including warnings about ECT without consent. Coercion, of course, is a human rights problem in general, but when it gets layered into gendered institutionalization, it becomes a feminist justice issue, and it has been for many years. So the questions around ECT and morality and ethics are not only clinical, they are incredibly political, as many things are in relation to feminism. Who decides what counts as treatment? Who is allowed to refuse treatment? When does a life-saving intervention become a form of state violence? These answers matter in relation to feminism, and they have changed unevenly across centuries and decades. Now, if you're listening as someone who values nuance, fair, me too. Modern ECT has been practiced and is usually practiced under anesthetics with muscle relaxants, and has documented efficacy for severe treatment-resistant depression, for example, or life-threatening catatonia. The NIH or the NIMH consensus and subsequent professional guidelines, which include multiple APA task force reports, have all accepted that ECT can, in fact, be effective, but they also emphasize technique, training, and consent as non-negotiable safeguards to this practice. This is not an either-or argument. ECT is helpful for people while simultaneously having risks and, more importantly, a troubling history of misuse. What complicates the "it works" narrative is the experience of cognitive harm and persistence of non-consensual application. Memory loss, especially autobiographical memory, is one of the most frequently reported adverse outcomes, and for many survivors, it is one of the most devastating effects. That's why modern guidelines stress minimization of cognitive side effects, measurement-based care, and full informed consent. This is why activists keep pushing for better patient protections and alternatives. But let's be blunt, because that's exactly what happens on Stranger Things. The use of electric shock therapy against women has always had a narrative component. It's not merely about brain chemistry, it is about storytelling. Who gets to tell the story of women's minds? From the 19th century diagnosis of hysteria to the mid-century institutional psychiatry, there's a through line where female expression becomes pathologized and treatments aim to quiet the expression. That is not an accident. It's social control disguised as therapy. There is also a long, powerful counter-history. Journalists, survivors, researchers, all who have insisted on centering the patient narrative. Nellie Bly's investigative work in the 1880s, which exposes asylum cruelty, is one of the earliest examples of public accountability that we have. And later, survivor activists formed groups like the Committee for Truth in Psychiatry, published memoirs, and targeted regulatory change. These movements changed how we continue to talk about consent, trauma, and oversight in psychiatric care. If you want to understand the practice's human cost, listen to survivor testimonies or read critical histories, all of which are probably available at your local library, which I cannot recommend enough that you go and utilize. That's how I got some of this information that we're talking about here. I simply did not have enough time to read enough survivor testimony to include any of them as a cited source. However, I will be reading up on this because I find it fascinating. Brain stimulation today includes less invasive options. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, is one big example. And the neurotechnology landscape is consistently changing as we gain more technology. And that's hopeful. But technology alone isn't just a cure for old problems. The same structures of power that allowed coercive ECT in the past can co-opt into new tech unless we insist on patient-led consent models, legal safeguards, and structural reforms to psychiatric care, for example, funding for community supports or less reliance on institutionalization, more improved outpatient resources, things like that. And that's why Terry Ives' storyline in Stranger Things hits like a gut punch. It's not just sci-fi horror. It's a mirror of what women have lived through over and over again. A mother who knows the truth, who refuses to let go of her child, who is punished with silence through force and electric shock. The show renders it supernatural, but the roots are painfully real. Women that are stripped of credibility, of memory, of voice, and all under the guise of treatment. If we read Terry through the feminist lens, she reminds us that the mind flayer isn't only a monster that is possessing will. It is also a metaphor for the systems that swallow women whole when they step out of line. And if we believe Joyce, Terry, Elle, or any of the other women in Hawkins, survival doesn't come from being quiet or complacent. It comes from refusing to stop screaming the truth, even when the world tries to shock you into silence. Okay, let's dive into today's Quickie. We are looking at episodes 4, 5, and 6 of Season 2. If you have not watched Season 2, episodes 4, 5, and 6, hit pause, go watch it, and then come back. Chapter 4, titled Will the Wise, written by Paul Deichter and directed by Sean Levy. Chapter 4 is about revelations, but the kind that devastate rather than heal. This is the moment that Stranger Things pivots, in this season at least, from a spooky small-town drama into a full-blown horror. And it does so by making the body, especially the body of a child, aka one Will Byers, the central site of violence. We open with Joyce finding Will mid-possession. His temperature plummets, and he is speaking in riddles about a monster that is growing, spreading, killing. The shadow monster isn't out there anymore. It's not something that's outside of him. It is inside of him. And this reframes Will's arc, because he's no longer just the boy who survived, zombie boy, but the boy whose survival is now weaponized against him. His body becomes a colonized space, a literal battlefield. And it's disturbing because it reflects how trauma actually works. It embeds itself. It can rewrite memory. And it creates rifts with the people that we love and care about, just like what is happening with Will. Meanwhile, Will returns home to Hopper, and the conflict between them finally detonates. The fight escalates into a full screaming match, culminating with Elle shattering every window in the cabin. It is her first real tantrum. A psychic tantrum, if you will, and the eruption of power and pain that has been simmering since Hopper decided that protection meant isolation. What's striking here is how the show frames female anger. When Elle explodes, it is destructive, it's dangerous, it's uncontrollable. But Hopper's anger? That's just discipline or dad stress. And this is a feminist lesson in who is allowed to lose their temper and who gets punished for it. Elle's window shattering moment is both terrifying because you recognize just what she is capable of. We're just scraping the tip of the iceberg of what she is capable of, what it means to repress your power when you are somebody who holds this amount of power. But it's also deeply cathartic because she is no longer small enough to be contained. On the investigative front, Jonathan and Nancy step into the role of whistleblowers. They arrange a meeting with Mrs. Holland, Barb's grieving mother, only to get cornered by Dr. Owens at the lab, and he tries Intimidation 101. Surveillance, veiled threats, gaslighting, all of the tricks from the patriarchal handbook. But Nancy and Jonathan flip the script. They've been secretly recording everything that Dr. Owens has been saying the entire time. It is a rare moment in Hawkins where the truth isn't just spoken, but documented. And it matters that it is Nancy, not Hopper, not the boys, that are leading this charge. Back at the Byers' house, Joyce and Hopper try to ground Will in his drawings, plastering every inch of the wall with frantic vine-like sketches. It's one of the season's most visually striking sequences. The Byers' home turning into a living map of Hawkins' corruption. It wouldn't be Casa Byers if the house wasn't being torn apart to communicate with Will in some capacity or another. Hopper to the rescue when he realizes that it's not nonsense. It's tunnels, and it's a spreading network under Hawkins. Of course, he doesn't share this out loud, and it creates problems later on. Elsewhere, Dustin's secret pet storyline hits a breaking point, because Dart devours poor Muse the cat in one of the season's most brutal offhand deaths. The horror isn't just about the gore, it's about Dustin's complicity. He wanted to be somebody who made a grand discovery, he wanted to be important some way, he wanted to nurture this creature, but in doing so, he incubated danger. It is the same logic as every boys will be boys narrative, turning a blind eye until the damage is irreversible. And yes, on this podcast, we are vehemently justice for Muse. Always. Not sure why there was not a bigger, Barb-sized internet campaign over the death of this cat. Meanwhile, Max voices what every girl in a boy-coded group project feels. Completely excluded. She confronts Lucas about being kept out of the loop, while Billy doubles down on being a complete racist and a violent gatekeeper. Max Mayfield is and always will be my favorite character of the show. I love how cool she is. I love how outspoken she is. She is a girl after my own heart. And her storyline is less about the monsters and more about the patriarchy, how abusive men patrol the borders of girlhood with fear and with fists. Something that I think many girls have distinct recollection of when they realized that they were separate from their male counterpart and their male peers. And then we get Elle's discovery. While cleaning the cabin after her psychic tantrum, she finds Hopper's hidden file on Hawkins' lab, learns about her mother, and she learns about Hopper's betrayal in keeping it from her. Devastated, she reaches out psychically to her mom and sees the truth. Terry Ives is alive, but trapped in a catatonic loop, reliving the theft of her daughter over and over again. It is heartbreaking feminist horror, a woman silenced not by death, but by being stripped of agency. Her resistance erased by the same system that stole her child. Elle's heartbreak isn't just personal, it's generational trauma. The episode closes on Hopper digging into the pumpkin patch, literally tunneling into Hawkins' rot. And the camera slowly flips upside down as he descends into the tunnels in one of the most cinematic sequences of the season. Because the shot isn't just stylish, it's obviously symbolic. The upside down isn't just beneath Hawkins anymore. It is in Hawkins. It's here. It's not a veiled reality. It's spreading. It's tangible. And as the clock tolls faintly in the distance, the show foreshadows Vecna and the Vecna storyline, and also a larger truth that the rot isn't just temporary. It is permanent and it is spreading. This episode is the turning point. It's where the walls begin to close in, the lies start unraveling, and the horror is no longer something you can run from. The upside down is no longer contained. It is colonizing. The retro glow of this episode, which is the best 80s nostalgia, I think has to go to all of the sort of interwoven story of A Nightmare on Elm Street. So Elle is connecting with her mom in this like liminal psychic space, and it echoes Freddy's dream realm thing that happens in that movie, where like time keeps looping and trauma like keeps replaying endlessly. And then our Boombox Bliss, which is the best needle drop of the episode, and it is Scarface, Push It to the Limit by Paul Engman, which is playing when Hopper is like in his truck. It kind of like splits how it is being played in the show. It's when Hopper's getting into his truck and he's got all of these messages like, would you please freaking call Joyce Byers back? She's been calling all day. And then it kind of switches to the high school where Billy and Steve are playing basketball and he is like, plant your feet. Chapter 5, Dig Dug, written by Jesse Nixon Lopez and directed by Andrew Stanton. Dig Dug is an episode obsessed with the idea of entrapment, physical, emotional, and, of course, psychic. Hopper, our resident dad with a shovel, literally digs himself into the upside-down tunnels and gets swallowed whole. The vines don't just restrain him, they literally begin to entomb him, which we kind of saw a little bit of this in season 1 with Will, when they pull Will off of the wall with like the vine life support as it's like down his throat. Sometimes everything in the upside down is a little goopy and disgusting. So these vines are working to sort of entomb and like mummify and kill him, strangle him, and it is turning him into the show's sacrificial dad archetype. It's certainly meant to be heroic, but it also says a lot about how male pain in the world is treated with gravitas, while women's pain, like Joyce Sleepless Terror, or Elle's rejection, or Terry Ives' literal catatonic state, gets framed as quote-unquote backstory or side plot. Will, who is half boy and half surveillance system at this point, becomes the show's most devastating metaphor. His mind is able to project Hopper's danger like a psychic live stream. On one hand, it is genius storytelling that the possession blurs what is real. But on another hand, it is true horror. A child's body being used as a weapon, his suffering is consumed as information. I think Noah Schnapp is phenomenal across these episodes and in this season. I think season 2 is an incredible season for his acting. When Joyce watches Will seize later on, it is not just maternal anguish. It is the compounding cruelty of this system that keeps denying the severity of the issue of what is happening to Will and allows her son to become collateral damage. Meanwhile, Elle goes to her mother's house, and instead of the heartwarming reunion that she is hoping for, she gets rejection. Her aunt slams the door in her face, reminding us that girls tend to be overlooked as frivolous since her aunt literally thinks that she's there to sell Girl Scout cookies. It is only through a psychic breaking and entering where she unchains the door with her mind and throws it open and says, I want to see Mama. And then, followed with a psychic breaking and entering of Terry Ives' mind, literally forcing herself into her mom's mind, does she learn the truth that Brenner stole her as a fetus, that her mother fought to get her back, and that this system that they have been operating in as Hawkins Labs has silenced her with electroshock therapy until she wasn't an issue anymore. It is the kind of storyline that is literally ripped from feminist history. Forced sterilizations, women institutionalized for resistance, mothers erased when they do not serve a patriarchal order. Terry isn't just a side plot. She is a mirror of what happens when women are punished for trying to fight back. Elsewhere, the Scooby Gang keeps spinning. Lucas tries to earn Max's trust, Dustin goes rogue with Dart, and Jonathan and Nancy meet Murray for their Expose Hawkins Labs arc. Even Bob, sweet, clumsy Bob, becomes the hero for cracking Will's crayon map of Hawkins. It's clever, but telling. Bob's brain is celebrated as brilliance, while Joyce's obsessive insight into her son keeps being treated like hysteria. Mothers get called crazy, and fathers, or in this case, temporary father figures, get called geniuses. And then there is Max, calling out the show itself. She meta-narrates all of the critical commentary about season 1, and it is funny, but it is also the writers tipping their hand. They pay attention to what we say online, and they pay attention to what we theorize about. By the episode's end, Hopper is freed, but only just in time for the feds to arrive with flamethrowers. Fire meets fine. And while Hopper stumbles out of his predicament, Will collapses into a seizure, and it becomes very clear every solution that this show has to offer will come with a deep collateral and it is usually the most vulnerable who will pay the price. The retro glow. Dig Dug, of course, the titular name of this episode, which is a reference to an arcade game, one that I genuinely love, in which the character, Dig Dug, has to dig tunnels in the game, kind of like Hopper has to do in this episode. Boombox Bliss. The best needle drop of this episode is No More by Billie Holiday, and this is what is playing when Murray puts on the record to help him digest all of Nancy and Jonathan's revelations. And last but not least, Chapter 6, The Spy, written by Kate Treffry and directed by Andrew Stanton. If Dig Dug is about entrapment, then The Spy is about infiltration. The monster is in the house. The call is coming from in the house. Will is no longer just the boy who survived. He's the one who's been turned into the Mind Flayer's Trojan horse. His memory continues to slip, his voice shifts, and by the end, his own body betrays the people that he loves the most. It's possession as a metaphor. Trauma isn't just something that happens to you, it is something that is consistently rewriting who you are. This is something that we will continue to explore as we move through the story of Stranger Things. There's a lot of trauma that happens to all of these characters. At Hawkins' lab, Dr. Owen shows Hopper the Mother Gate, the literal wound in the earth. The scientists that treat it are treating it like an abstract problem, but Hopper's the one who sees the human cost because, he was just swallowed up by it. What Owens misses, and what the show is quietly underlining, is that colonization is the true horror here. The vines, the spores, the gates, they don't just grow, they claim, they take over. The same way that the Mind Flayer is literally colonizing Will. Meanwhile, Nancy and Jonathan bunker down with Murray, who is our truth teller, our vodka connoisseur, and our chaotic matchmaker of this season. What a yenta. The two finally cave to his nudging and sleep together. But Murray is the real star. His breakfast one-liner, "How was the pullout?" is vulgar, hilarious, completely unforgettable. But it's also very telling. He's the only adult in Hawkins who is willing to actually say the thing out loud. Whether it's about sex, whether it's about Hawkins' lab's corruption, Murray's refusal to censor himself makes him dangerous. Honesty is its own kind of rebellion, especially in a show like this. Back with the kids, we get one of the most quietly radical beats of the season. Max opening up to Lucas about her family. She admits that her parents are divorced and that her stepbrother Billy is abusive and that she feels caught in the middle. It's the first time the show really gives her depth with any of the characters that are our main characters, even though Max becomes a main character, beyond just the identity of a new girl with a skateboard and she's cool, right? It is rooted in a feminist truth that girlhood often means managing male violence. Again, I talked about this for last episode, but it's true. I think Max is a really good exploration of what it is to be a young girl or a teenage girl and recognize in some way or another, whether that is sexual, physical, emotional, or otherwise mental, that there is a discrepancy between women and men and who is safe and who is not and how to manage that. It's very sad, but it is very true and it's very relatable. And not only that, but sometimes that it's happening in your own home. What I love is that Lucas doesn't swoop in to fix it. He's not a white knight. He just listens. He believes her, and he holds space for her. And this shouldn't be revolutionary, but these are, in fact, sensitive boys who identify as outcasts, so they tend to be more sensitive and emotionally driven characters. But it is revolutionary for a boy-centered narrative, even though the show doesn't always focus on the boy-centered narrative. The core four was 4 boys. That's what it opened up with. The world has expanded, our characters have expanded, but in reality, it was 4 boys and their show and what has grown and evolved from it. So it is a little bit revolutionary that we're having these conversations and that this is the type of character that Lucas is. It makes the chemistry between Max and Lucas undeniable. So undeniable that even Dustin notices it. The junkyard scene is Stranger Things at its best. It is kids building traps, Steve stepping up as live bait, everyone being terrified but absolutely brave, and yes, Steve's evolution from king jerk to protective himbo is absolutely iconic. His strength now comes from the amount that he cares, not from cruelty. Very nice character arc with Steve. We stan Daddy Steve. This is what masculinity can look like when it is divorced from dominance. And whoever in the writing room said, here's all of our characters, we've got to pair everybody together so that the story makes sense, whoever decided to put Dustin and Steve together, whether that was just their off-screen chemistry that they were like, let's bring this on screen because these two people just jive in real life, I'm not really sure. But Dustin and Steve is, in fact, one of the best pairings that we get over Stranger Things history. The brilliance of this episode, though, comes from its ending. Will apologizes to his family and friends as his body is completely hijacked and his love is completely weaponized. It is heartbreaking because it is familiar. How many survivors of abuse or manipulation have felt their own voice being turned against them? How many systems rely on intimacy as a form of leverage? The Mind Flayer isn't just a monster. It is the patriarchy personified, a force that invades, controls, and that weaponizes familial connection. The retro glow for this episode is Invasion of the Body Snatchers, obviously. The way that Will says he likes it cold, and then all of these sort of like slips is a warning. The spreading of the Vine-like network to the absolute paranoia horror where humanity is just slowly being replaced with something alien. Invasion of the Body Snatchers 101. Boombox Bliss for this episode is Hammer to Fall. It is by Queen, one of my favorite bands, and it is playing as Steve and Dustin have their first merge meetup, and Steve starts to question Dustin about Dart as he starts to drive him home, and then we see the re-emergence, the Hammer to Fall of the nail bat, Steve's nail bat. So I love that. I love that scene. I think it's great. All right, let's crack open the burn book where we will look at the superlatives for this episode. The Bold and Bothered Award. This is strictly for the Femme and the Furious. It is the quote or the moment that really relays feminine rage, and in this episode it goes to Max Mayfield, reaming out Lucas for not including them in their party. The Shiro Award goes to the baddie who is the most inspiring or the moment that is the most empowering. And this episode it goes to Nancy Wheeler for recording Dr. Owens in the Hawkins lab. The Femme Fatale Award, for the most smash the patriarchy moment of the episode, and it goes to Terry Ives for fighting like hell for her daughter. Speak Your Truth Trophy, the best quote or line from this episode, and of course it goes to Murray. How was the pullout? Honorary Heartthrob, because I am just a girl, okay, and I want to talk about the most swoon-worthy moments, and for this episode it goes to Bob Newby, who comes to the Byers household with games that will make Will feel better because he just thinks that Will is like a normal sick, not being possessed by an interdimensional mind flayer. And that is it. That is this week's episode of Femme Furious. If you like this week's episode, share it out with your friends, follow along, leave a review, all that good stuff. Follow on social media, and I will be back here on Friday. We are diving into, of course, Taylor Allison Swift's Life of a Showgirl. We will do a breakdown of every track. I'm really excited about it. Be back here on Tuesday. We will be wrapping up Stranger Things Season 2 with episodes 7 through 9. And until then, just sneak out of your house and meet us at the junkyard, okay?